Summer, 1945. A train door slides open to the crushing Texas heat. A line of German women, prisoners of war, step onto the dusty platform. They had been taught their entire lives that Americans were monsters. They were prepared for starvation, for cruelty. But the first thing that hit them wasn't a guard's shout, it was a smell. Buttery cornbread, fresh from an oven. They were being guarded not by brutes, but by Texas cooks, who seemed bizarrely skilled at their job. And in this strange new prison, they would soon learn that the most powerful weapons aren't made of steel, they're made of bread. Before we see how this story unfolds, if you believe in the power of these forgotten histories, make sure you hit that subscribe button. And I'm always curious, let me know in the comments what city you're watching from today. The train doors shrieked open, spilling a wall of heat so thick it felt solid. For Liesl Brenner, the air was the first enemy, a physical thing that stole the breath from her lungs. She stepped from the dim rail car into the blinding white light of a Texas summer in 1945, her hand clamped tight around the worn leather handle of her Red Cross satchel. Inside it, her mother's recipe book was the only part of home she had left. Around her, the other German women, nurses, clerks, secretaries of a fallen government, flinched under the vast, pale sky. They squinted at the horizon, where endless miles of dry grass met the shimmering heat. This was it, the place from the stories, the land of the monsters. Liesl had prepared herself for what came next. She expected barking dogs, snarling guards with cruel faces, the glint of sun on barbed wire, and the gnawing ache of a starvation she had only read about. She was ready to be strong, to be the nurse, to hold the others together. But the first thing that reached her wasn't the sound of brutality. It was a smell. It snaked through the thick, dusty air, a scent so out of place it felt like a hallucination. Cornbread, rich and sweet, the dark, comforting aroma of coffee, and butter. A wave of confusion washed over her, more disorienting than fear. They were marched in a loose, exhausted line toward a series of long wooden barracks under the punishing Sunday. This was Camp Hearn. The guards were young men, their faces flushed from the heat, their uniforms creased with sweat. They carried rifles, but held them loosely, their gazes more tired than menacing. In the mess hall, Sergeant Thomas Redding watched them come. He was a quiet, solid man who believed two things with absolute certainty: the rules of the Geneva Convention and the profound dignity of a well-cooked meal. He ran his kitchen not out of pity for the prisoners, but out of a fierce, unbending pride. Feeding these women, the enemy, was his duty. Doing it well was his honor, a stubborn tribute to a standard of decency he refused to surrender, even if the locals in town muttered that it was a disgrace. Men like Tom had sons overseas, and the town of Hearn was still burying its own. They saw the steam rising from the camp kitchen and tasted nothing but resentment. Inside the mess hall, the German women were directed to long wooden tables. Plates were set before them, piled with mashed potatoes, green beans, and a thick, golden slice of the cornbread they had smelled outside. The scent was a torment. It promised warmth, comfort, home, all the things that were now lies. The women looked at each other, their faces tight with a shared, unspoken terror. This was a trick. The food was poisoned. It had to be. Liesl stood, her posture rigid, the nurse's authority returning to her. She spoke for them all, her voice low but clear. They would not eat. The room fell silent. Tom Redding stepped forward from the kitchen, wiping his hands on his apron. He looked at the line of defiant women, at their pale, determined faces, and felt a quiet sting of insult. He wasn't trying to poison them, he was trying to feed them. His son had died at Anzio, and some days, Tom didn't know if this work honored his memory or betrayed it. But the rules were the rules. He looked directly at Liesl, his voice calm and even. You don't have to eat, but you'll be treated decent. That's the rule. He turned and walked back into his kitchen without another word, leaving the women to stare at the plates of cooling food. Later that afternoon, Mary Lou Carter pulled her dusty Ford truck up to the camp supply entrance. The back was loaded with crates of fresh eggs from her farm, each one a small victory against the grief that threatened to swallow her whole. Her husband had died at Pearl Harbor, and the war had carved a quiet, permanent hollowness inside her. As she unloaded the crates, she saw the German women sitting in the slivers of shade outside their barracks, their faces like stone. She felt a familiar surge of anger. They were here, safe, while her husband was gone forever. From the mess hall door, she saw Sergeant Redding trying to offer one of them a plate, a gesture that was met with a stiff shake of the head. It was a confusing sight, this gentle offering to an enemy who refused it. The image stayed with her. That evening, driving past the camp on her way home, a flat tire forced her to pull over. The sun was setting, bleeding purple and orange across the sky. In the deepening twilight, she saw a figure sitting alone on the steps of a barracks. It was one of the German women, the one who seemed to be their leader. Before her on the step sat a plate of biscuits, untouched, and the woman was crying. Not loudly, but in the silent, body-shaking way of someone whose sorrow was too deep for sound. In that moment, Mary Lou didn't see a Nazi. She saw a widow. She saw herself. The shared language of loss was stark and brutal under the Texas sky. Haunted, Mary Lou fixed her tire, but before she drove away, she walked back toward the barracks. In a swift, quiet motion, she took an extra loaf of bread from her truck and left it on a fence post near the woman's building, a small, anonymous offering, before disappearing into the dusk. Hours later, long after the others were asleep, Liesel was still sitting there, the cold biscuits a monument to her fear. Her stomach twisted with a hunger so profound it felt like it was hollowing her out. Then she saw it, the loaf of bread, wrapped in cloth, sitting on the post. She approached it slowly, her heart pounding. A trap? But there was no one. The camp was still. She unwrapped it. It was simple, crusty bread. She looked back at her uneaten plate and picked up the piece of cornbread. It was cold now. Trembling, she lifted it to her lips. She took a small, hesitant bite. The taste exploded in her mouth, sweet and gritty, simple and real. It tasted of the earth. It tasted safe. It was the first taste of kindness she had known since the war began. And as she swallowed, she felt something deep inside her, something that had been frozen for years, finally begin to crack. A fragile rhythm took hold of Camp Hearn in the weeks that followed. The initial terror gave way to a dull, grinding routine, punctuated by small moments of unexpected humanity. Liesel, with her Red Cross training, found a semblance of purpose, assisting in the small infirmary, tending to fevers and minor injuries among the other prisoners. Her quiet competence was a shield against the suffocating boredom and despair. But that shield cracked one afternoon during a heated argument with another woman over a letter from home that had been censored into meaningless scraps. The dispute escalated, and as punishment for disrupting the peace, Captain Dunn assigned Liesel to the one place she had been trying to avoid, the kitchen. She arrived expecting humiliation, a task meant to break her pride. Instead, she found a strange kind of order. Sergeant Redding watched her with his usual unreadable expression, handing her a knife and pointing to a crate of onions. Liesel worked with a focused, almost defiant precision. Her hands, trained for sutures and bandages, moved with an anachronistic grace, dicing vegetables into perfect, uniform cubes. Tom said little, but he noticed everything. The clean, efficient way she worked, the lack of wasted motion, the discipline that mirrored his own. A wordless respect began to grow between them in the humid, fragrant air of the kitchen, a language spoken in the clatter of pans and the steady rhythm of a blade on a cutting board. Corporal Alvarez, the young guard from San Antonio, would sometimes hum a soft tune while he worked, and Liesel found herself storing away the unfamiliar melodies. It was in the kitchen that she began to see the Americans not as a monolithic enemy, but as individuals. There was the serious, burdened Tom, the gentle, joking Jimmy, and the others who were just tired young men doing a job. Mary Lou Carter continued her twice-weekly egg deliveries, her heart still a battlefield of competing emotions. She kept her distance, her interactions with the camp staff brief and businesslike. But she watched. She saw Liesel, now in an apron, moving through the kitchen with a familiar weariness. One sweltering morning, as she waited for her empty crates, she heard a soft, humming sound drift from an open kitchen window. Liesel was scrubbing potatoes, humming a tune under her breath, a German lullaby. Mary Lou froze, her hand gripping the door of her truck. It was a song her husband had loved, a melody from an old record he'd bought before the war. To hear it here, in this place, from the mouth of an enemy, felt like a ghost had reached out and touched her. Her carefully constructed walls of resentment began to crumble, worn away by the simple, devastating power of a shared song. As autumn painted the Texas plains in shades of gold and brown, a new energy stirred in the camp. Thanksgiving was approaching. It was an American holiday, meaningless to the prisoners, but Tom Redding was determined to mark it. In a decision that surprised everyone, including himself, He allowed the German women to help with the preparations. The kitchen became a bustling, chaotic classroom of cultural exchange. The Americans demonstrated how to make mashed potatoes and cornbread stuffing. The German women, led by Liesel, showed them how to make sauerkraut and a rich, fragrant apple strudel from a recipe Liesel knew by heart. For one afternoon, the cavernous mess hall was filled not with the tension of captor and captive, but with the shared, purposeful energy of a harvest feast. That evening, as they all sat at long tables, guards, prisoners, and kitchen staff, a fragile peace settled over the room. For a few hours, they were just people sharing a meal, a strange and wonderful hybrid of American tradition and German memory. During a story told by Corporal Alvarez, Tom Redding laughed. It was a real, deep laugh, the first anyone had heard from him since his son died, and the sound hung in the air like a miracle. A few days later, Mary Lou, feeling emboldened, taught Liesel how to properly fry catfish, a skill as Texan as the heat. Liesel, in turn, carefully copied the recipe onto a blank page in her mother's tattered notebook, a small act of hope. The peace was shattered in the first week of December. News from Europe finally arrived, and with it came the photographs. Pictures from the liberated concentration camps, piles of bodies, skeletal survivors, the geography of an unthinkable evil. The images circulated through the camp like a virus, poisoning the air. The guards' cautious kindness curdled into cold fury. The town's resentment flared into open hostility. One night, a guard, drunk and enraged, stormed through the camp and tore apart the small vegetable garden the women had been tending, stomping the carefully nurtured plants into the dirt. Mary Lou couldn't bring herself to make her next delivery. The face of the woman who hummed her husband's lullaby was now superimposed with the horrors from the newspaper, and the shame of her own brief flicker of empathy felt like a betrayal. Tom, his face set like granite, ordered stricter rules. No more fraternizing. The kitchen was once again a place of silent, rigid duty. One evening, after the camp was quiet, Liesel went to the kitchen for a glass of water. On the prep table, she found her mother's recipe book. It was open, and one of the pages, the one with her grandmother's notes, had been torn, a jagged rip across the faded ink. The small, private act of vandalism was more devastating than any public cruelty. It was a violation of her last connection to home, to memory, to love. She sank to the floor, clutching the ruined book to her chest, her body shaking with silent sobs. "Maybe we deserve this," she whispered into the empty, silent kitchen. "Maybe we are the monsters after all." Standing just out of sight in the darkened pantry, Tom Redding heard every word. He felt the weight of them land in his own chest, but he couldn't find the words or the courage to offer a single ounce of comfort. A cold, quiet winter settled over Camp Hearn. The blistering Texas sun was replaced by a pale, indifferent light, and the wind carried a biting chill across the flatlands. The silence in the camp was heavier now, thick with unspoken accusations and the ghosts of the newspaper photographs. The easy rhythm that had briefly warmed the kitchen was gone, replaced by a tense, methodical efficiency. Tom Redding moved through his days haunted by the sound of Liesel's whisper in the dark. "Maybe we deserve this." The words echoed in the quiet moments, a counterpoint to the grief for his own son. He felt a gnawing guilt, not just for the torn recipe book, but for the wall of silence he had helped rebuild. Decency, he was discovering, was not a passive state. It required action. And so, with Christmas approaching, he made a decision. He would cook a Christmas meal, not just for the guards, but for everyone. It was a defiant act of routine, a small rebellion against the suffocating hatred that had poisoned his camp, and in secret, he decided to include something else. He had watched Liesel make the apple strudel for Thanksgiving, his cook's mind memorizing the practiced fold of the dough, the sprinkle of cinnamon, the scent of baking apples. He would make it himself, from memory, a silent apology he couldn't speak aloud. Christmas Day arrived grey and damp. The prisoners were marched into the mess hall, their faces sullen, expecting nothing more than another meal in a long line of identical meals. The guards stood stiffly along the walls, their expressions closed. The room hummed with a tense, oppressive silence. The food was served: roast chicken, potatoes, gravy, and eaten with mechanical movements. Then, Corporal Alvarez brought out the dessert, slices of warm, golden-brown apple strudel. Liesel stared at her plate, her fork frozen in mid-air. She recognized it instantly. The delicate layers of pastry, the precise aroma of cinnamon and apple. It was her mother's recipe, a taste of a life that no longer existed. Slowly, she took a bite. The flavor was a physical shock, a wave of memory so powerful it brought tears to her eyes. She looked up, her gaze finding Tom Redding standing by the kitchen door, watching her. In that moment, she understood. This was not an accident. This was a message. Hesitantly, Liesl stood up. The clatter of forks on plates stopped. Every eye in the room turned to her. In halting, heavily accented English, her voice trembling but clear, she spoke into the silence. You showed us what we were told. You could not. She looked directly at Tom, her eyes shining with unshed tears. Mercy. The word hung in the air, fragile and immense. The room was utterly still. Tom Redding cleared his throat, his own voice rough with an emotion he rarely showed. He didn't look at Liesl, but at the room full of faces, the angry young guards, the defeated prisoners. My son, he said softly, fought in Europe. If he were captured, I'd hope someone would have fed him too. A quiet collective intake of breath swept through the hall. In that shared moment of grief and acknowledgement, the rigid lines between enemy and guard, between victor and vanquished, blurred into something human. Several of the German women began to weep, quiet, cleansing tears for losses they couldn't name. In the months that followed, as the war in the Pacific ground to its conclusion and the world began to pick up its broken pieces, a cautious warmth returned to the camp. Liesl was eventually allowed back in the kitchen. One afternoon, she found Tom Redding alone, and with a small, shy gesture, she offered him her mother's recipe book. He took it gently. On a clean page at the back, he carefully wrote down his recipe for cornbread. When Liesl finally boarded a ship to return to a Germany she no longer recognized, the book was her most prized possession, a chronicle not just of family, but of survival and strange grace. She opened a small bakery in the ruins of Hamburg, a city rebuilding itself from ash. She called it Hernbread. Decades later, in a quiet museum exhibit in Texas, dedicated to the state's forgotten history of prisoner of war camps, a young woman stood before a glass case. Inside lay a worn, tattered recipe book, its pages yellowed with age and stained with use. She was Liesl's granddaughter, and she read aloud the inscription on the book's final page, the familiar, strong handwriting clear, despite the years. The words were not in German, but in English. It was Tom Redding's hand. Feed them right, it read, even when you can't forgive them yet. A quiet hush fell over the small crowd. War had divided nations, but here, in the neat cursive of a Texas cook and the enduring legacy of a German baker, was a simple, profound truth. Mercy had fed them all.